Welcome welcome all. This is our third lockdown conversation event at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. My name is Father Dragoș Erescu. I'm the principal of the Institute, and I'll be hosting is too big of a word. I will just be guiding a little bit the conversation this evening, and our panelists will have sort of prime place this evening. I'm delighted to welcome everyone, to see so many familiar faces here and some new faces and some new names. I'm very much delighted to welcome our panelists, whom you'll hear from presently. As I mentioned, this is our third lockdown conversation event. In many parts of the world, the lockdown that followed the pandemic as it spread is no longer in place in the same way. We continue to use this sort of name for this event because it seems that in some parts of the world, the UK included, measures to restrict again the movement of people or access to public spaces, possibly spaces of worship again, are being announced. In the UK, for example, well, in England, certainly, they've announced that from next Monday, there'll be again a limit to 6 people meeting in public spaces. We don't know whether this will affect, again, public worship. We're waiting for details in that sense. But this just goes to show that the issues that are related to this ongoing situation with the pandemic and things that affect the life of people of faith, which we're concerned with, particularly during these conversation sort of days, conversation events, are still very much present. Some of the issues that our panelists will address this evening, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute, will hopefully continue to touch on things that we all find relevant. And I'll just mention a few of them. Our panel this evening will look at the global aspect of the pandemic and the challenge or the opportunity of global solidarity in times of crisis. They'll consider, again, local responses to conditions of lockdown, either in terms of churches or particular parishes, or for the life of Christian families, related to issues of prayer, of community, communion, and Christian identity. Another issue that will be considered this evening will be, again, these issues of ecclesial community and identity when we cannot go to church, or when what we understand as participation is restricted. And also, last but not least, this very much still open and very controversial in a sense, or equally sensitive issue of receiving communion or distributing communion during this time of pandemic, when you have a very infectious virus, will be considered as well. So having said this, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we will ask them to say them something about some of these issues that I've just mentioned. Delighted to welcome Dr. Clemena Antonova. Clemena, would you like to say something about yourself briefly? Thank you.
Well, first of all, hello to everybody, and thank you very much for including me in this very interesting event. I'm an art historian by training. My areas of research interest are Eastern Orthodox iconography and theology, as well as Russian religious philosophy, with a focus on someone called Pavel Florensky that may be familiar to some of you. I work at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and this is where I spent the lockdown. So, Dragos, do you want the other people to introduce themselves? Or?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Clemena. That's wonderful. I'll ask Dr. Marcus Plested to say something about himself. He joins us from the United States of America.
Yes, hello, Dragos. Lovely to see you and all sorts of other familiar faces. Yes, I'm Marcus Plested. I was, well, at the Institute more or less from its inception, going back to 2000, and in my case, till 2013 when I took up a post in America at Marquette University in Greek patristic and Byzantine theology. And of course, we've been pretty much staying put in America during this period of lockdown and so forth.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I'll now ask Father Demetrios Batrelos, who joins us from Athens in Greece, to introduce himself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I live in Greece, in Athens. I'm a priest in a small parish in the Church of Athens. And I've been also visiting professor at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies for a long time.
Thank you so much, Father Demetrios. Well, I'm delighted now to ask our very own, Dr. Elizabeth Theokritov, who joins us from Cambridge, to introduce herself a little bit, to say something about herself.
Yes, thank you, Father Dragos. I too have been involved in the Institute in some form since its inception, but rather peripherally. Since 2016, I'm living in Cambridge, and so more involved as a research associate and also occasional lecturer, with a particular interest in theology and environment, although that's not what I'm talking about now. And I have been locked down in Cambridge, but thanks to the wonders of technology, I've been able to visit a number of my various home parishes in different countries for services during this period.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'll now ask Dr. Dennis Monasteriano to say something about himself. Delighted to have him speak for us this evening. He joins us from Scotland, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. It's really a privilege to be with you in this conversation. I am a Romanian living in Scotland, in Glasgow. A little bit of an oddity because I'm an Anglican. I might have been the only Anglican in my city, Iași, before moving here. I lived most of my life in the evangelical fold, but I joined Anglicanism under the impact of my interaction with Father Stanislaw's theology, his ecclesiology especially. And in the process, I became more sacramental and liturgical than an evangelical would ever be. So I had to follow my conscience. So that's where I am today. My interest is, as I said, ecclesiology, and I'm deeply committed to the evangelical Protestant Orthodox dialogue. I'm a board member of the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you. I will now ask Father, Reverend Dr. Father Liviu Barbu to say something about himself. Father Liviu.
Hello, good evening to those who are here in the UK. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm quite honored to be part of this panel discussion. I am a tutor at the Institute. I mostly look after students who do distance learning with us. I also look after a parish here in East Anglia, around Norwich and the other areas. And I'm just looking forward to this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Liviu. It's very clear that we have quite an international panel, not just because we have people speaking from the States and from Greece and from Bulgaria, and obviously from Scotland here in the UK. It's also a bit of an ecumenical panel, thanks to Danuts being present here. I think that's in a way deliberate, because we tend to think, and certainly my conversations with people have tended to be very much focused around what happens in the Orthodox Church. And although we're aware of what's happening somehow tangentially in other Christian communities or churches, we often don't get that perspective. And to me, at least, one of the effects of this pandemic has been that we became a little bit parochial in our preoccupations with the issues raised by this. So in a way, with this in mind, I would like to start by, to get the conversation going by asking Dr. Clemena Antonova to maybe say something, reflect a little bit on this global reality of the pandemic, these issues about global solidarity in times of crisis. We often see that we struggle with this type of attitude or this type of understanding. So Dr. Clemena, dear Clemena, over to you.
Well, thank you. As I said, I spent the lockdown in Vienna, and I would just like to share with you some of the thoughts and problems I've been grappling with during this period. I think, like many other people, one of the questions that I was thinking about was, what is the right thing to do for Christian in this situation? And I think that this question became quite urgent for me, especially at the time of what specialists call, the peak of the infections in Italy and Spain, where you had hundreds of people dying every day. At one point, there were 900 people. And, I kept thinking about that from the point of view of the concept of solidarity. Now, I think that this is what made the answer and my attempt to think through the whole issue quite complicated, because I think that solidarity itself is a very ambivalent notion. In this sense, it's different from, say, compassion. Compassion has an obviously positive connotation. This is not the case with solidarity, because solidarity it implies at the same time inclusion and exclusion, those who are in and those who are out. And I think that this is very clear in the Stoic figure and notion of the circles of sympathy. However much you extend your circle of sympathy, still the majority of people are going to be outside it. So this is what I think makes the whole conversation about solidarity quite interesting on an intellectual level, but also morally it makes you morally anxious. So I think that when you think about it from this perspective, the general question of what is the right thing to do becomes a very concrete question. Whom do you owe solidarity to? And I think that in most situations in life, and especially at the time of crisis, you find yourself in a context in which you have a clash of solidarities. You have to actually decide between, whom to give medical equipment to, whom to not to give access to medical equipment, and so on. And I think that generally, the way I thought about this crisis was as one in a series of global crises that we have been witnessing in the last several years. The one in 2008, the financial crisis, the refugee crisis in 2015, and the current crisis. And I think that there are two things that I find important about that. I think that we can see all three of them as tests of solidarity, and we can see all three of them as global crises that have affected the whole world. And with the coronavirus crisis, this is actually forced upon us in a very obvious way. We are talking about a virus that doesn't respect borders. And in this sense, we're in a fundamentally different position from, say, Adam Smith in the 18th century, who famously said that most of us would be much more upset about losing their little finger than the death of millions of people in a terrible earthquake in China. And now we literally saw how a terrible disease in China in a few weeks spread all over the world. Now, this is how I come to my point that basically, if you have a global crisis, well, clearly it must demand a global solution. And this is how you come to the idea of the very possibility of global solidarity. Now, my hypothesis here would be that global solidarity is literally, in its most radical form, an invention of Christianity. It didn't exist in pre-Christian societies. Even when we talk about the Stoics' idea of a citizen of the world, which is what comes to mind in the context of cosmopolitanism and so on, actually what the Stoics meant was the community of the wise. And one should think that at the time and now, this is a very, very tiny group of people. So in this sense, I think that this crisis has brought to the fore the need to rethink the very possibility of global solidarity. And this is why I think that a Christian take on that is actually something which is very, very much needed. It's not just an intellectual issue, and it's not just of interest to people who happen to be Christian. Now, I think that when I say it's an invention of Christianity, I think that we can talk about that for quite a long time, but I just want to summarize one idea in the Bible: Christ's repeated identification with the stranger. From this perspective, quite literally, when you let Italian grannies die in hospitals in the north of Italy, you're literally letting Christ die. So, and I think that the various ways in which we can actually think through this idea. And I'd like to finish, because I know I don't have that much time, I'd like to finish with something which, an idea that comes from my own small field of research, Russian religious philosophy and Pavel Florensky. I thought that one of the ways in which he develops and sort of modernizes a Christian dogma is quite relevant for our discussion now. He basically looks at the dogma of consubstantiality and applies it to describing relationships between and among people. So it's not that we just share a common humanity. Many other philosophies and theologies have the same idea. A lot of secular philosophy has the idea of people sharing a common humanity. But it is actually a very radical form of sharing humanity when what you share via the humanity of God. It is because of Christ, because of God becoming man and the incarnation, that the bond between us is, in a Christian sense, is in a way much more radical than in other traditions of thought. So these are just a few fragmentary ideas, but I think they all revolve, in my mind, they all revolve around the ideal and the possibility of global solidarity. So did I keep the time? I think so, more or less.
Sadly, you did. Thank you so much, Clemena. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the things that you've just sort of touched on. Thank you very much for that. It's a very powerful idea, this idea about global solidarity, and the way that you've sort of unpacked it so far. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to address the next question to Dr. Marcus Plested, because although we live in this global world and so much connected, a lot of us had to rethink what we understood our home to be in terms of ecclesial space and relations of community and spaces of prayer. And I was hoping that you could say something about that, Marcus. I know that, for example, in the States, people have to drive quite a bit to get to a church, possibly more than people have to do this in the UK, certainly more than people do this in Eastern Europe, for example. And what do people do when they don't have access to a church, or when the lockdown conditions are so harsh that they are bound to rediscover, in a way, the sacred space of their home?
Lovely, thank you very much. Yes, we have 7 churches in Milwaukee, each of which is exactly 20 minutes away. So yeah, 20 minutes might be longish by English standards, but not too bad. Yes, I'll move, I think, from the fascinating, slightly more macro level of Clemena's very lovely presentation just now to a more kind of micro level. Looking micro level. Appearing here, Becky. Well, I am actually talking about the family in the first instance. There are 7 of us in the family. So when our church closed its doors, which was, I think, on just after the Sunday of St. Gregory Palamas, and remained shut until, I think, the Ascension, we were thrown back very much on our own resources as a family. And there are 7 of us, including this one here. And yes, we had our freshmen back from Marquette. We were the complete family, as it were. So we had 7 people. We could do a certain amount. We could do a certain amount for Holy Week in particular. So yeah, being thrown back on our own resources meant that we had to think more carefully about prayer as a family, particularly on a Sunday. And during Holy Week, Matthew, you can sit down over there and just watch, okay? So for Holy Week, as Macquarie will probably be able to tell you, we were able to do a few processions as a family, which was quite nice. We made processional crosses for Palm Sunday and wandered around the block with them. And of course, it was Easter on the Western calendar, so we were happily shouting out Happy Easter to everyone. We weren't insisting, oh, no, it's only Palm Sunday. But and for Good Friday as well, we were able to do a procession. We had an epitaphios, which my wife had made, which was rather beautiful. And on Easter night, we did the banging on the door and who is this King of Glory and so forth. We had banging on pots and pans for Easter Saturday morning, for Great Saturday, an awful lot of stuff. Macquarie, you're going to have to leave, I'm afraid. Okay, go and tell Mummy. Go and tell Mummy Daddy's on the thingy. Okay. Sorry about all that. Yes, anyway, family life. So, and this was rather wonderful in many ways, and I don't doubt there are many blessings that came from it. I think it is important for individuals and families to realize that they have a responsibility to be church, as it were. It's not just a matter of turning up on a Sunday and more or less spectating the liturgy. And just having that time together as a family, including time as a family at prayer, I think is tremendously important. And no doubt there are many blessings, some silver linings coming out of this pandemic, but we can't get away from the negatives as well. Clearly, being able to participate in a liturgy via Zoom or what have you is no substitute. And we've had a mass excommunication, haven't we, of the laity in particular, lasting in some instances several months. And this is an extraordinary situation to find ourselves in, sort of mass excommunication. As I say, I don't think participating in the liturgy via Zoom is any real substitute, even though of course it can be quite nourishing in its own way. So let me move on to a few more, perhaps slightly more general considerations. One of the things which quite struck me in this pandemic is the I mean, churches vary, and you know, individual jurisdictions within churches vary quite a lot. But I've been very struck by the degree to which many churches have been almost more eager than whatever government regulations tell them to do, more eager to close down than they have to. And you know, I can't help thinking that many of the churches have managed to classify themselves as non-essential services at this time. Or sort of branch of the health and safety executive. And I think if you know, the church has been through, you know, far tougher times than this without closing down, except when it had to. I'm thinking of the era of the persecution when churches kept going, and, or, you know, more in the early church, and also more recently in communist systems where, you know, of course, many parishes and churches were closed down, but the church continued to function, continued to meet, and in many places. And I think it's quite remarkable that this virus, I mean, nasty as it is, but relatively benign to some other historical experiences of Christianity, has managed to shut down whole churches and excommunicate whole populations for a very long time. You know, and just to sort of move to some sort of conclusion, it's also remarkable to me that churches have often been sort of more preoccupied by the health of the body than the health of the soul. You know, the church is meant to be about the health of the soul first and foremost, it seems to me, and displaying a kind of fear of illness, which I think doesn't necessarily sit well with the central Christian message. Anyway, there's a few thoughts from me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark.
With the assistance of my my little Macri.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Yes, very very powerful ideas there about the sort of de facto excommunication of the laity because of the lockdown. And again, maybe we'll come back to this issue about the eagerness of some churches to close down so quickly. And in a sense, I resonate with you that doesn't seem, there hasn't been a sort of a coherent kind of response from the churches to argue for less of a moderate shutdown in terms of churches and so on. So thank you very much for that. Following from what you just said, I think it would only make sense to ask Father Demetrios to say something, share something of his experience as a parish priest, possibly at the other end of the spectrum, because as a parish priest, or all priests were not, as it were, excommunicated in the sense by the pandemic. They tried to continue to hold services in one form or another, whether in their homes or in churches with limited participation of servers and so on. What has your experience been, Father Demetrios, in Athens, in Greece? We know that Greece was one of the countries that was very quick to enter into lockdown. And again, it was a shock to many that, again, churches were closed so abruptly, in a sense.
Yes, I mean, it all happened very suddenly and very quickly, and we were all taken by surprise, of course, because no one had faced anything like this ever before. And it's true that the government implemented a lockdown at a very early stage, and this saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. But very early, the churches also had to close down, and this meant that for a month, we were not allowed to have services at all. And for another month, we were allowed to have all services, but only up to 4 people could be present in the church. That is to say, the priest, 2 chanters, and an altar boy. So this was a very difficult and challenging period, and I think it helped us realize and remember 2 things, among others. First, that it was a tricky decision and a practice with, pros and cons, as Marcus pointed out. But again, I think that for many of us, the point was that we ceased to come together not in order to protect ourselves that much, in order to protect other people, Christians and non-Christians, churchgoers and non-churchgoers, from contracting the virus and then facing perhaps fatal health problems. So we acted, or we had to act, not that much out of fear, than out of humble and sacrificial love for other people. And second, we had to realize and remember that we don't go to church, we are the church. And we are the church even when we can't go, and therefore we don't go to the church, that is to the church building. But in any case, we had to find ways to stay together, stay connected in this difficult period. And we did this with the help of technology, and more specifically via initially Skype and then Zoom meetings. So let me just this a little bit. So as we know, we distinguish two parts in the liturgy. The first part, which is usually called the liturgy of the word, and the second part, which is the celebration of the Eucharist itself. So in the Orthodox Church, we tend to emphasize the second part, and justifiably so, but sometimes we do this at the cost of the former part. And I think it is no secret that in many Orthodox liturgies, there is either no sermon, or the sermon that is delivered is of a rather poor quality. And this makes people don't really like that much to listen to a poor sermon. So there is a vicious circle there. A poor sermon leads to negative reactions, and this is disheartening perhaps for the priest, and so on and so forth. So we miss something of the power of the liturgy of the word, including the sermon. But now a communication via talking to each other, via listening to a sermon and then discussing about this, was perhaps the only thing we were left with, at least for a certain period. That's a first point that I wanted to raise. And the second point has to do with an essential part of the Eucharist itself. So what is the Eucharist? So many theologians in recent decades have emphasized the eschatological and joyful aspect of the liturgy, and this is fair enough. Provided, however, that we do not forget that the Eucharist is also essentially and perhaps primarily a sacrifice. It is our participation in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. So there is this element of sacrifice, of thessia. And as we see in the Gospels, Christ first taught and then sacrificed himself for the life of the world. And we do something similar in the liturgy. We have the readings and the sermon and then the Eucharistic sacrifice. And this is what should happen in real life as well, because we tend to say good and nice words, but these remain largely ineffective unless they are combined with acts of sacrificial love. So now Christians in the midst of the pandemic were making for themselves and for all other people, for one another and for all other people, a huge sacrifice. Out of obedience to the synod, to the doctors, to the government, they ceased celebrating the sacraments. And of course, the solution had its own problems, as I said, but still the element of loving sacrifice was there, was part and parcel of this decision and this practice. There was a sacrificial phronema there. And although the new situation was painful and costly, it has a sacrificial spirit which did not allow it to become alien to the Eucharistic sacrifice. So the fundamental way we dealt with the lockdown conditions was through having Zoom meetings for this 2-month period. So we used to meet twice a week at first and then once a week for about an hour and a half. It was an opportunity to see each other, to deliver a talk, to discuss on the topic of the talk and so on and so forth. And during our meetings, I noticed a few things which I would like to point out. First, that the turnout was impressive. We had twice as many people as we do in a normal Sunday liturgy, and 5 times as many people as we do in our talks in the church. And this was, of course, the case because it's easier to communicate via Zoom from your room than to go to the building of the church itself. But also it showed that people were in real, perhaps in desperate need for consolation, support, nourishment, and communion. So we're forced into a kind of monastic life during Lent due to the lockdown, but this was the spiritual oasis from which we all took great benefit in our kind of solitary monastic ordeal. Second, it was quite impressive how quickly people were able to adjust to the new situation. I mean, even people who knew virtually nothing about computers were able to connect, first through Skype and then through Zoom, and attend our meetings. And thirdly, and most importantly, that God blessed this endeavor. And I think he blessed the sacrifice of his people. And I'm saying this because many people approached me, both during the lockdown, but also after it, and told me how much benefit they derived from these meetings. Just to use an example, to give an example, a lady, a regular churchgoer in her late 40s, a mother of 2 children, said that this was the best Lenten Holy Week of her life due to these meetings. This is perhaps an exaggeration, but it shows how this endeavor worked. Of course, this had to be an exceptional emergency measure, and when the lockdown came to an end, our meetings also came to an end. We were now able to go to the church and celebrate the liturgy once again. But during the lockdown, I think first we realized the importance of worship. What we used to take for granted, I mean, possibility to go to church and worship God, receive Holy Communion, was during the lockdown an impossibility, and it made us realize how important it is and to long for it perhaps more than ever before. But second, it gave us an opportunity to realize the importance and the spiritual power of the liturgy of the Word. And now that all this has come to an end, for the time being at least, I think we are able to take all this into account, and from a practical point of view, to complement our church activities with occasional Zoom meetings as well, as actually we are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Demetrios. I very much appreciate that you've managed to highlight so many positives in a way from a situation that at first sort of read doesn't seem to be all that positive. What you just said reminded me of an article that I read recently. Many possibly other people here have come across the headline. The Roman Catholic Cardinal or Archbishop of Luxembourg just said that in his opinion, the pandemic pushed forward secularization by about a decade. So that's interesting. He said that people will not, because of online services, people will no longer, will have grown out of the custom of going to church, for example. And I mean, if you look for the article, it's very easy to find now online, his interview. But this is an interesting idea that we might keep in mind, because it seems that the responses have been different. My own experience has been as well kind of similar with yours, Father Demetrios, that people in my parish and the community, people that I spoke with, felt that they benefited immensely from online services, from being able to join in that sense and not lose the connection. And I think, as you said, has helped them to come back to church when we were able to do that with a bit more awareness and a sense of longing that possibly was lost before. So again, thank you very much, Father Demetrios. Well, I'd like to go now to Elizabeth and maybe try and ask her, based on what Father, also continuing from what Father Demetrios said, what kind of lessons do you think we've learned about what it means to be one body? Father Demetrios kind of touched on these things, but we spoke about this, and it feels that you have something interesting to say about this, Elizabeth. So what do you think have been some of the lessons that we've learned in terms of community, in terms of being one body because of this pandemic?
Thank you very much. During the months of lockdown, one quotation that kept going round in my mind was that monastic saying from Evagrius that the monk is one who's separated from all and united with all. And this experience that separation teaches us unity is one that has been shared generally in secular society and in the church, and it's something that Clemena touched on at the beginning, and this I'll come back to. But first I want to say something about one likely objection. You know, somebody's going to say, well, yes, and Evagrius didn't have the benefit of Zoom, and quite so. You know, of course, what we aim for is to have a sense of prayer so that without any electronic or visual aids, we're aware of our unity with everyone who isn't physically present with us. But I'd venture to say that streamed services are actually very helpful for much the same reason that icons are very helpful. As St. John of Damascus points out, we're not disembodied spirits or indeed disembodied minds. Even if we can't touch things, we need at least to see and hear them. And again, at risk of being shocking, I see a certain parallels between the way an icon functions and the way that streamed services functioned. Neither is something that you simply look at objectively or indeed passively. You stand and you go about your life in relation to this visual image, and in a sense its presence, it sees you, its presence judges you. And the parallel may, I think, make us reflect also that perhaps we risk making an artificial distinction in the ways in which we experience God through material creation, because creation encompasses the laws of physics and the properties of materials on which this whole digital edifice depends, every bit as much as it encompasses oil and water and bread and wine. And bread and wine, of course, equally require human knowledge and understanding to make them, to shape the created things. So to come back to discovering unity through our separation, the key, I think, was that, however paradoxical it sounds, we were all separated together. And that, of course, included the clergy. You know, if they had families, they were with their families, but especially when they were unable to use a church. And personally, some of the most moving services I joined in during the lockdown were celebrated in priests' homes with his wife or family, if he was lucky enough to have a musical family at home, as the choir. And it's sad to me that some bishops forbade this. And this experience of, you know, the liturgy, two-person liturgy in the priest's house was the absolute antithesis of a private service. It came across as the divine liturgy stripped to its bare essentials, which is the sacrifice of Christ under the open sky, no longer within a confined space, and for the life of the world. And so any thought we might sometimes entertain that the Eucharist is offered for the little group physically present is revealed thereby as the absurdity that it actually always is. And two lessons from this: one is pastoral, that there's no longer any illusion that those absent for good reason are a separate category, people we pray for, yes, but not us. We've all been there. And so perhaps we should be giving more attention to how we fully include in church life those who are always in that condition, the housebound, chronically sick, and so forth. Whether this means streaming services or streaming talks and other events, or more traditional means, you know, being more punctilious and organized about taking people communion, prosphora, holy water, and so forth. Do we need then a more pastorally active diaconate? And should we perhaps be doing more to organize the laity to undertake some of these ministries? And following on from that, the experience of isolation from going to church, I certainly wouldn't say isolation from church, has, I think, challenged us as lay people, as Marcus was saying, in a slightly different context, very much to take ownership of our status as members of Christ, to recognize that we've been chrismated into an order, the order of the laity. We are the fullness of the church. We're not this sort of bunch of buying, you know, illogical sheep waiting to be chivied hither and thither. And our responsibility to live out this calling cannot be displaced to a particular building, the church building, and the time we spend there. Our ministry is to make the place we live and work somewhere appropriate for Christ to enter. And of course, this isn't a new idea. And of course, the fact of personal responsibility for our thoughts and words and deeds isn't a new discovery. But we've perhaps had a reminder that this doesn't belong to a separate sphere of personal morality, in contrast to the building up of the church, which is, you know, an institutional matter and the job of the clergy. No, I think we've seen, and I hope we'll remember, that the edifice of the church is only as robust as every one of its living stones. And I recognize that not everybody's experience of the lockdown has been as positive as mine. A friend of mine in Greece, not in Father Demetrius' parish, I hasten to add, was saying, you know, she has no enthusiasm for tuning into the broadcast services. It was a male club. Well, since all those present were in orders or altar boys, yes, they were all male. And this points to a perhaps more deeply rooted problem. The services during lockdown, and doubtless for some time to come, are necessarily more ordered, more regimented, people assigned to roles and jobs, perhaps even times when they could come to church. Traditionally, this is precisely the sort of thing that the church does with its various orders, but I think the question is raised, do the existing structures of orders actually correspond to the realities and needs of our church communities? If the community needs a particular person to lead or to sing, or indeed to be a doorkeeper, should it not acknowledge that need and the responsibility of that church member by blessing him or her to the office he or she is actually performing in you know, some form of service with appropriate prayers? And as with the need for an invigorated diaconate, I think there's the question whether we're able and willing to have some flexibility in the way we think about minor orders and blessings to particular roles in the church. And this is certainly not rethinking what the church is, but it is rethinking how it can most appropriately manifest its essence today. And I think it's very apposite here that what Father Dragos just quoted, that this has pushed forward secularization by 10 years. After this massive disruption in church life, I would wonder how far people are going to be prepared to go back, simply slip into the old normal in every aspect of church life. Sorry, I've gone on rather a long time.
No, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for this very considered contribution. I very much appreciate that you've made us think again about the relationship between clergy and laity, and possibly more so, you made us think about the role of laity, or the sacramental quality of being a baptized member of the church. I think we can very easily forget about that, and clergy possibly can fall into this temptation of downplaying the importance of sort of the laity, of the non-ordained members of the church in this body of Christ. Thank you. With again, starting from what you've said, I'd like now to ask Danuts to possibly say something, because in the evangelical or Anglican context, there is a lot of emphasis on the participation of laity, as it were, both in singing and in the contribution that they can make, in testimony sometimes. How has been your experience? What do you see as having been different? How do you see this context of 2 or 3 people being gathered in Christ's name, sometimes without a priest, to worship, to manifest the church, to live out as Christians, when they cannot go together and join other people in the church building, for example?
I come at this like Elizabeth, the perspective of a layperson. And I have to say from the beginning that my experience of the lockdown has not been a negative one. Of course, there are things I miss. I'm a traveler. I have a little bit of a gypsy blood, so I miss traveling. I hope I'll take revenge after this is over. But otherwise, this whole situation allowed me to reflect on things and to experience things that I did not experience to this extent before. What I want to share with you is inspired by what Metropolitan Callistos said a few years ago when he was invited to do some lectures on the church at North Park University in Chicago, and asked about how he sees the future of the church. He responded by quoting the Savior, saying, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I promise, I am, I will be." And he suggested that from this promise of Christ, we could reimagine something that was a strength in the early church, which was the existence of house churches. And he, of course, was commenting on the inadequacy of the size of parishes today, that this needs to be rethought, and so on and so forth. Now, I would say that this pandemic has challenged us on a number of areas. And this reimagining of house churches may be one of them. I think the pandemic confronted us with something that usually we don't get, which is our dependence on buildings and on public meetings. And we are called to remember that there were periods in the history of the church when Christians did not have buildings, or when they were forbidden to use those buildings. And this situation, I think, is of the pandemic, and that kind of example in the history of the church is encouraging us to look for resources for renewing our understanding of how we can be the church in difficult circumstances. So 3 sources of renewal in the present situation. The first is that of understanding the sacramental dimension of our engagement with the Word of God. In church, we hear the Word in the liturgy, but when we cannot be there on a regular basis, we can resort to our own Bible reading and understand that that has a certain sacramental dimension. A second source of inspiration for us could be, as Bishop Callistos was suggesting, the example of the early church, which did not depend on buildings but survived in small entities. A third source of encouragement for us could be the situation of Christians in persecuted lands, like Christians in communist lands, or today in some Muslim environments. And in those limit situations, Christians developed creative ways of being church. And I think this pandemic is inviting us to explore this kind of ways. Because my connection is not very good and I don't want to bother you more, I just want to end saying that I think this situation is confronting us with the importance of looking back at the concept promoted by Father Jon Bria of the liturgy after the liturgy. I think in it we can find inspiration for reimagining how we can be the church in tough times.
Thank you so much. A very fresh and refreshing contribution, as I at least was expecting and looking forward to from you. Thank you very much for this. The last, but certainly not least of our speakers is Father Liviu Babu, who I think would like to say something, and I would like to ask him to say something possibly in a bit of a conclusion on issues of prayer, praying from afar, and communion during this pandemic. Maybe say something about the issue of Holy Communion that is still very much an ongoing issue these days in terms of distributing Holy Communion. So, Father Liviu, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Father Dragos. Yes. Well, I can only add a bit to what has been said so eminently before me. I would like to quote Abba Alonius, who was a desert father, who said this interestingly. If a man, or in our language nowadays, if a person does not say in her heart, in the world, there is only myself and God, she will not gain peace. That person will not gain peace. So I think this lockdown was a blessed time for us to remain with God alone and with ourselves, and of course with those closest to us, and face our own shortcomings. Hopefully we had the time to put some of that right. And because I think we are nowadays distracted by many things. We have jobs, sometimes more than one, and probably knowing or unknowing, we try to avoid being on ourselves, being with God alone, and always find a distraction in our work or other things, let's say legitimate things to do. And only now, I think, we were able to just be able to pray more, to see, you know, what could be fixed in our relationships, how we can improve. And I'm thinking of this leitmotif in ascetical theology. You know, if someone wanted to be of use to the community, first was going into a retreat, facing up his own demons, as it were, then coming out and serving the others after they have overcome themselves. And we have the example of Abba Anthony and many other great saints. So we could learn a bit from that. And I think we also learn more about the basics of Christianity. So no matter how important it is to be together in church and with one another, I think we should also learn to be with ourselves, with the nearest to us, and with God. And as a priest, I learned the power of prayer, of not being with my people in the same place. I had to pray for them from a distance, and they were depending on these humble prayers. And I think I could got just a glimpse of, of this prayer that embraces everyone, that Saint Silouan speaks of. And we all, I think, in our good moments, when we are okay with ourselves, with God, I think we could pray for the others in that very intense mode. Now about a few words about the mystery of Holy Communion. And I think there is a good theological justification for, the communion received from the same cup by all of us. In that we, as we know, express our union with Christ and with one another. And it's our fellowship, our brotherhood and sisterhood, which is expressed in partaking of the Holy Communion. Now, I think although to many of us, the unorthodox response to the pandemic was slow and maybe not so uniform as we would have wished, I think the churches, the local churches, the national churches, have taken quite wisely the decision not to change much in the liturgical practice of our church. And that would have meant that we allow, earthly authorities to have a say in the way we practice our church in the most intimate, things of our faith. And I think we had two options. One was the dramatic one, to go underground and just, forget about what the governments are saying to us. And the wiser one, which we thankfully adopted to mind the regulations and use our own pastoral wisdom. And people were quite compliant with all these regulations. And I think somehow God has shown us the way forward. Now, just to finish with a few words about some of the ideas which have been circulated in some circles by some academics. Probably I will not name anyone now, but about the virus and the Eucharist. Now, some have tried to say that, look, like in the person of the incarnated Son, we have the divinity and humanity. Divinity, it's uncorruptible. Humanity is corruptible. I don't know on what basis. From whatever angle you look at, that cannot be sustained. Such an idea. As we know, the divine and the human, nature in Christ were united, though distinct, but fully united. And that is the case in the Eucharist, where we partake of the body and blood of Christ. And others still were trying to explain out the mystery of the Eucharist to the outside secular world. And that reminded me of a less inspiring chapter in Manuals of Systematic Theology, where it was argued about, with logical arguments for the existence of God. I think there is no need for such argumentation, and I I think the medical and secular world is not interested in what we believe. And I'm sure if they would go to an Orthodox church and see how we normally receive communion, would be something out of this world for them. So I will close by saying that the 2 millennia practice of the church demonstrates, well, I wouldn't say in every respect, but mostly that we are right to fully believe that what we receive in the Eucharist is truly the body and blood of Christ. And if it was otherwise, I'm sure being a priest would have been the most dangerous job in the world. So I will end with this, and of course there is space for discussion. And I want to say that we have to be very careful and minister to the people who have faith and approach the chalice, still even now in a time of pandemic. We should not be fearful and anxious as the world outside is, but receive them with faith and in faith and with love as well, but also not to be judgmental of our own people who might have some reservations in regard to the way they could receive the Eucharist. So I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Liviu. And indeed, thank you to all of our speakers this evening. We have maybe about 20 minutes or so for questions and hopefully answers to those questions. So from the virtual audience, as it were, may I just ask, you're very welcome to raise your hand. If you don't know how to do that in Zoom, you just you really just go to the
reactions, actually.
There's, yes, so just raise your hand or type in chat a question that you want to ask, and to allow the speakers time to actually respond. Please make your questions as to the point, or your contributions as to the point as possible, and as clear as possible. So the floor is open to anyone who wants to ask a question to any of the speakers or to the panel as a whole. And thank you again to you all. Great. Well, since there doesn't seem to be a question forthcoming just yet. I'm sorry. Father Patrick, you would like to ask a question. Excellent. Then I'll ask you to unmute yourself. Thank you. And then Clemena wants to ask a question as well.
I suppose I'm not so much asking a direct question as just sort of some throwing some ideas out into the discussion as such. I think there's a lot of silver lining material which has come out of this, the benefit of having technology for Zoom and stuff, and that people have benefited from this, that some people have taken more time to pray, to connect with their families during this. But I'm going back to a little bit what Marcus was talking about, the sense of excommunicating the laity to a large degree. And I'm of the opinion that to be church is precisely realized in the coming together into one place, in a physical sense, to actually be together in the same space. And this is realized fully in the church building, though it could be in the catacombs, it could be even outside. But the church building captures this most perfectly, is that we come together as one body. And this requires a physical presence into one space. And so we are church properly in the sense when we come together for the, as one body in the morning prayers and the evening prayers, the church comes to pray. And then obviously this is fulfilled most fully in the Eucharist, where we come together as the church, and having offered as the church, we then receive the body and blood of Christ to sort of fulfill that realization as being the body of Christ. And I think some of the reactions and things like Skype and Zoom meetings fail to allow this real mystery in the sense of being together in the same place. It can only be really realized coming together in the same spot physically. And I think there's this realness of especially in the Orthodox sense of being the body, that we really physically need to be together in the one space. And this has raised a challenge about the identity of church. And I think to me also that we are constantly, eternally the one body of Christ. And so this coming together, it needs to be a constant, forever going thing. At least once a week, if not daily, we should be meeting together for evening prayers or the morning prayers. So we're constantly realizing our state as the church by coming together as the church. So I've just thrown this out in the sense that I think we really are excommunicating people when you forbid them to come to the church. And I don't think the service liturgy of a church is a liturgy just simply of the clergy. It has to be all the people coming. And to exclude anyone from the gathering is really to exclude them from the church. And it's in a sort of quite a powerful way. So I think I'm just throwing these ideas out, but I think some of us I haven't seen really addressed is about our whole concept what the church is. And my other point is as well, this relationship between church and state. I think Father Liviu was talking about this, and that I'm a little concerned that the state feels it has any right to deal with the health and safety of the church. It's surely the bishops are in charge of the spiritual matters, in charge of also physical matters of this flock, and that it's their duty and call to decide the safety of their flock. Now, I'm not saying that there's wrong or right decisions exactly what to make this, but the principle is that the sense of division between church and state, especially in the UK, I think there is a sort of assumption that the church is simply a department of state, which a state can decide when and why and people can worship, rather than just advising the bishops on that decision. So that's something I'm finding a little challenging, is how quickly some churches have reacted to the pandemic, almost just following the state carte blanche, almost more enthusiasm than the state itself has offered. And I do find that troubling when the church, as I said, if it is about being together in the one space, should have been struggling to its uttermost to avoid breaking that, except when necessary. And I'm not going to call which one way or the other, whether you go underground or whether you conform to a certain degree, what's right or wrong. That's all depends on circumstances and the decisions of the bishops and clergy. But anyway, I'm just throwing those little pieces out.
Yes, thank you very much for the review, Father Patrick. I think you echo to a degree some things that, well, at least Marcus has mentioned there. But if anyone of the panel would like to sort of pick up anything that Father Patrick has mentioned, please do. I'm also mindful that Clemena, as a panelist, wanted to contribute something now, to add something to what something that she said possibly, or to say something in relation to another point made during the...
No, it's actually the same point, really. I was just thinking while I was listening to some of the presenters, but also the last comment, that one of the ways in which we could actually see the whole debate about whether the churches were closed too early, whether people should be allowed to go to church or not, is actually to see it in connection to something else that has been happening quite a lot recently after the lockdown, is actually these protests you see all over the world. And I think that very much the debate there is actually very similar to the debate you have about going to church. You know, we live in a modern secular society in which people put so much value on caring for your health. And when you have the protest going on, people who go to the protest don't necessarily say that there is no virus and there is no problem. Everybody more or less realizes that it is a context in which you spread the virus. But a lot of these people think that you have, again, a conflict of different values. You value your health and the health of other people, but you also value other things like democracy. You go out, like in Bulgaria, we now have anti-corruption protests and so on. So I think that it is useful. So this is not really a question. It's more like a suggestion of one way of approaching the issue, to take an outside secular point of view and to actually see the whole issue in terms of, I think Marcus mentioned something like that, about these sort of competing values, the caring for the body, caring for the soul. It's also caring which values do you care for. And I think that probably one of the, in our modern societies, we have, which is a good thing, a great focus on health. But it's sometimes such a focus which is almost out of proportion to anything else. Longevity and health are like the big issues, in a way in which many other important aspects of life become almost peripheral. So this is all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Clemena. Yes, it's a wonderful contribution from you. Before just allowing, I think, anybody else to say something or ask a question, I know that Christoph wants to ask a question, and Antonis has a question that he would like to put to the panel as well. I may just to say one thing is that this dual perspective about sort of and the difference of opinions, or the variety of, or the plurality of valid opinions that we tend now to consider in relation to this, possibly can sort of have a maybe we can consider that really in relation to what it means to be church. I mean, we keep coming back to this idea, and we seem to be even tonight a little bit divided in terms of what we mean by church, what it means to be church. One way of looking at it, which is very much in a sense dependent on the physical space, on the physical gathering, something that we're very used to and we tend to do as normal when there's no pandemic, as it were. But on the other hand, we have emerging this idea or arguments saying that we can consider the reality of being church, which is no less church in a different way, in home churches or in small groups, or as the Notes and Elizabeth, I think, were saying, being a bit creative about sort of the things that we can take for granted. And I don't think it's a situation of either or. It's possibly a situation of both, but there seems to be a bit of a difficulty transitioning to, or opening ourselves to the new ways that we can be church, and possibly considering them not necessarily better than what has been there before, what we normally do, but as an equally valid alternative that can sort of live side by side, possibly influence for the better what we understand as church, or being church, by going to a physical building that we call church and meeting together there in a sense of community and communion. Okay, James as well has a question. So I'll let Christoph ask his question so we don't delay any further. Christoph, please.
Thank you. Yes, I have a remark and a question. It's very brief. I think according to the best prognosis we have, the lockdown measures will actually do more harm than the pandemic, at least in the developing world and among the poor. And that's something we should keep in mind too, because hundreds of millions of jobs have been lost, and the consequences will only, emerge now in the next months and years. So one could argue that the lockdown, to some extent, protects the rich or the rich countries, but kills or does a lot of harm to the poor and vulnerable. So Professor Gupta in Oxford has argued along these lines. And in other words, I think that the lockdown, by and large, was motivated by fear and not by self-sacrifice. Of course, that doesn't exclude the possibility that individual people or groups, had a completely different attitude. But when you look at society as a whole, then it was motivated by fear, and that's rather an expression of selfishness. And this fear was certainly evoked, or at least reinforced, by governments and the media. For instance, it also led to new forms of nationalism, like you close the border, the states put each other on the blacklist, you're not allowed to go there when you come back, and so on and so on. So I actually don't see universal solidarity, but rather new forms of egotism and selfishness, because this universal perspective is not actually taken into account. Yeah, again, because the poor will pay the price for this in the first place. So I'm interested what the panelists have to say about this perspective on the pandemic.
Yes, thank you very much, Christoph. Anyone from the panel that would like to pick that up? Clemena?
Well, I thought that as Christoph said, universal solidarity, that he might have been referring to what I said at the very beginning. And I like to say that my point was partly that in the global crisis we have noticed recently, we've had tests of solidarity that our Western societies have failed. And I think that this is something to think about, because we actually have the wealthiest societies in the history of the world. So in other words, I don't think that we have noticed anything like universal or global solidarity. I think that the situation forces us to think about this possibility and to consider, what is the best way to react to a global crisis. I think we need global solidarity, we don't have it, So I agree with Christoph. I think that this is exactly the situation. And I think that, yes, politically and socially, it looks more and more like the virus started initially spreading everywhere and affecting everyone. I mean, look, even Boris Johnson went to hospital. But at the end of the day, it will be the poorest countries and the poorest societies and those at the bottom of the ladder who will pay the highest price.
Thank you. Father Livio?
Yes, just to say a few words about what Christoph said. I think our main duty as church, as Christians, is to not to fear, not to be anxious in the face of this adversity, and where everyone is puzzled. Now, yes, it's with hindsight, it's easy to look back and say, "Oh, we've been, we acted a bit stupid." I think as closing down everything, and including churches. But if we were, even with the price of our, let's say, why not our lives, if we were to give good examples to our people, that we not in fear, whatever, but we trust God. We because the church and the society has gone through even harsher, much harsher periods than this one. So that's, I think, is the main mission of the church in such times.
Thank you, Father Livio. Before we go to Antonis, may I just offer this remark? I don't want to sound disparaging, but I think fear is a very valid and very human and not necessarily a negative reaction to things. We shouldn't, I mean, the apostles reacted in fear when Christ was apprehended. I mean, and Peter was fearful when he walked on the water. Yes, the Lord did kind of tell him off about that. But fear is a part of the survival, as it were, instinct of humans, and it does not necessarily mean cowardice. It just means that you can still do the right thing if you experience fear. I don't necessarily feel that you should equate fear with making a bad decision about something, but maybe that's just me. Marcus.
Yeah, what's interesting about fear, isn't it? Because of course there are different types of fear. Yes. And I think some of the examples you gave weren't necessarily the most sort of positive examples of fear being constructive in the Gospels. And we also read, of course, that perfect love casts out fear. So there are kind of good versions of fear and less good versions of fear. And I suppose we need to concentrate on the former rather than the latter.
Thank you. Well, we certainly don't have perfect love. Hence, we do have fear. Great. Antonis, do you still have your question ready? Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Actually, I would also like to make an observation and to add the question. I'll be very brief. I would like to say, speaking of fear, there are many kinds of fear, as both Marcus and our host, excuse me, your name is Father? The host, your name is?
Father Dragos. Oh, yes, I just realized that.
Father Dragos. Okay, yes, I'm sorry. I need repetition to remember names. I'm sorry, it's my fault. Yes. There are some sorts of fear being from Greece. We have a nautical tradition. Sea captain told me that if you do not have some sort of respect and awe for the sea, which is also a kind of fear having to do also with self-preservation, you will go down with mathematical certainty. So you have to love, in this case, this example of nature, the sea, you have to love it, but you have to respect it. In this case, with the virus, I would say that fear from self-preservation, but also keeping a cool head is necessary. And I would like to add that I think the lockdowns are going to create a lot of economical problems, which of course these economic and financial situations are always more exacerbated in the poorest countries of the planet. Unfortunately, we have not found an international order which can distribute material wealth and resources better, unfortunately. But it was a good measure to restrain the spreading of the virus at the beginning, and to start from a lower point, which would not create huge problems with a lot of people getting ill, and the whole systems of the health systems actually in Europe and the hospitals in the United States collapsing from the sudden influx of people who need treatment and comfort. Okay, so there is this concern as well. So my question was about how secularization might have gone 10 years forward, which Father Dragos and Dr. Theokritov, Professor Theokritov mentioned, I believe. Can you tell us what this author was saying about your experience, or if any other panel members have any concerns or thoughts about that? How do you think that it has helped secularization? Because I cannot understand that, actually.
Okay. Thank you so much, Antonis. Thank you. Would anyone of the panel like to take up that question? Just to say that, Elizabeth, yes, please.
Oh, sorry, right, you can, you can't see me, but anyway, I'm here. The light's not very good. Yes, I mean, this wasn't it wasn't something that I had heard before Father Dragos mentioned it. And as for, so I don't know about the details of what the author was saying, or what he had in mind, but I mean,
well, I've just shared the link to everyone in the chat, so to the article that I was mentioning. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Yes, yes. I mean, what struck me was simply the fact of getting out of the habit of going to church, and habits, positive and negative, are extremely powerful. And B, the way that the church and the whole spiritual dimension of life has really been totally sidelined in the whole discussion, and the closure of churches and their relatively late reopening is an example of this. And therefore I think and the fact that everybody is focused on this fear for physical health, which is on the one hand natural, but on the other hand it is, partly it's predicated on the idea that this is the only life we have, and all these things I think mean that we have to work harder to rebuild the church community and rebuild a spiritual focus, and as really a churchly narrative of what this is all about, which is precisely what we're trying to do in this discussion.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to offer the possibility of James to ask his question before we completely run out of time, in a sense. So James, please.
Thank you, Father. I'm following on really from what several people have been saying, and in particular Elizabeth just now. The secular attitudes that kind of pervade our life have come to me during the lockdown in different ways. I've been very ambivalent about the live stream services, for example. I haven't really been able to engage with them as much more than a spectator. And I've really missed Holy Communion, which seems to me the fundamental maybe part of being a Christian. And I've taken the few opportunities that I've had to go and receive Holy Communion. So I've managed to do that several times. But one thing struck me, and it relates back to the remarks that I think Marcus made about the preservation of health and people being fearful to go to church. We passed through the first half of August, which was the Dormition fast, and there was the paraklesis every evening in the church, which was chanted, of course, by a chanter and live streamed, but nobody else was there. And it struck me that the history, as I understand it, of that service, the paraklesis during the Dormition fast, is that when there was a plague in Constantinople, sometime back in the Middle Ages, the people went to church every evening and must have crowded into the church to pray to the Mother of God to save them from the plague. And we, in our modern plague, were staying away from church in order to save ourselves from the plague. Now that kind of ironic situation struck me very strongly. We as Christians were following the secular pattern of dealing with this problem completely, wholeheartedly, it seemed, whereas you might say what we should have been doing was flocking to church to pray for deliverance. I wonder what anybody thinks of that.
Marcus, please.
Yeah, I completely sympathize and echo with what James says. I think he puts his finger on it very very nicely. And I think we've got to be rather careful, you know, in all our talk of silver linings. And yes, of course, you can get something out of Zoom liturgies or Zoom Bible studies or Zoom study of the fathers and so forth, but it's emphatically no substitute for gathering together as the body of Christ and consuming the body of Christ together.
Thank you, Marcus. Elizabeth, you wanted to add something, I think?
Yes, I totally take James's point that this is very ironic. On the other hand, the people in Constantinople flocking to the churches in times of plague had much less idea than we do of how plagues were spread. And it seems that given what we know, it doesn't make much sense to pray for deliverance from a plague while knowingly indulging in behavior that is likely to spread it, even for pious reasons. And, you know, while, as I say, I recognize the irony, I think if people are flocking to their computers to participate electronically in the paraclesis, that is actually quite a sensible substitute.
Thank you. Clemena, you want to add something, I think?
Oh, well, while we're still on the subject of the plague and secularization, I just saw that there's quite a good historical example of an incident that is called in Russia the Plague Riot. And it was at the time of Catherine the Great. There was a big plague in Moscow. And the enlightened decision of the Empress was that people would be forbidden to go to church for the time being, but especially to kiss icons. And this provoked a very violent reaction. You know, the person who actually read out the decree was killed, you know, and people were saying that they wanted their icons, they didn't want doctors. But I agree with Elizabeth that, you know, first of all, people knew much less about how the plague was spread. But the reason I'm citing this example is because I think it's such a good illustration of this sort of turning point, you know, the age of reason, modernization and secularization and changing attitudes. And here you have the clash of two worldviews.
Thank you, Clemena. I would like to add two things, if I may. One is that I think the decision, this blanket decision to close churches, in a way, in hindsight, says something about the lack of trust or the lack of faith by secular authorities or by the secular society in people of faith. And why am I saying this now? Is that now, since we've reopened churches, it seems to me that, well, at least in the church where I serve, we've been very adherent to respecting the regulation in terms of people wearing masks, social distancing, and so people have been very responsibly coming to church. And again, there's I haven't had feedback in the sense that people complain that they cannot pray because they have a mask on, or because they have to, you know, sit a little bit further from the other person. Again, in hindsight, possibly the churches could have. I mean, possibly it's a kind of a bit of a PR misstep from the church's side, because possibly there was not enough evidence before that people of faith coming to church or going to places of worship could be trusted to respect sort of the guidelines without having this blanket shutdown of places of worship. So, and the other thing that I wanted to say is that somewhat disappointedly, I noticed that a lot of the monasteries that we have, well, the monastery here in the UK, I think even Mount Athos, were very quick to close their gates to visitors. So, and I think some of them are not open even today to people from outside the community. So if we talk about this balance between protection, fear, whatever decision that whatever is the decision is based on, we need to be very mature about these examples, I think, because on the one hand we're saying that we should come together and we should be open and we should not have fear, but at the same time we have these very clear examples about certain communities making these decisions that are very protective of the community itself, in a sense. And that's no criticism, of course, but it just points out that there isn't really a very clear path through this context. Right. Well, I think we might have reached the limit that we set for this meeting. If there's no other question, I would really like to thank very much the panel for their generosity of offering their time and for the very creative and very engaging contributions that they had, challenging in some respects, certainly inspiring. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you to all who participated and joined us online this evening. Thank you for those who asked questions and made comments. I'll end by saying that we ask that you keep the Institute in your prayers, that you think about the Institute, that if you can support the Institute in any way, please do so, whether by word of mouth, whether by making a donation or by telling people about the activity and the mission that we have, about the courses that we offer to people either here in Cambridge or by distance learning. The Institute in Cambridge is a wonderful resource, I think, for all Orthodox and for the non-Orthodox. We live in a very ecumenical context here, and we work in a very ecumenical and international context. So having said that, again, thank you to all. God bless you. Stay safe, and hopefully we can send another email promoting a similar event before long. Thank you to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Father.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.